Good day and welcome to the second week of classes. Hope that you're finding yourself getting into a swing and a rhythm of the semester already, and at the very least that you're feeling acclimated to this class particularly, but to all of your classes as well. For today's discussion, I thought we might marvel at monsters and see what monsters can teach us. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and then we will get into a discussion about monsters. Okay, so marveling at monsters, what can they teach us? Oops, excuse me. So first I want you to imagine and think about what is a monster? What does that word mean to you? What images does it evoke? What feelings does it cause or inspire in you? And what do you think about monsters? And as you envision those monsters, how many of them come from nature? In fact, there really are no monsters in nature, right? There are creatures, there are critters, there are humans, and we might be fearful of them. Particularly, some of us might have arachnophobia, right? Others of us, like me, might love these cute little creatures. But in and of themselves, are they monsters? And so this is an interesting idea to ponder how monsters originate and how they're created and how they stem from the imagination, the creativity, the fears, any other sorts of things we'll talk about in a moment. But they're creations of humanity. And what's even more interesting is how different monsters are created by different people in different cultures. So, what do you see when you hear the word vampire? What's coming to the forefront of your mind? Are you seeing an Edward Cullen? Are you seeing Dracula? Are you seeing Nosferatu? Are you seeing one of the vampires from True Blood? Or maybe Stefan, one of the Salvatore brothers from the Vampire Diaries? What do you see? How monster-like, how seductive, how heroic. Now, how about werewolves? We've had a number of, going back to True Blood, there were a lot of werewolves. We've got Twilight had werewolves. Were we team Edward or team Jacob, right? So what sort of things, and how about mermaids? What do we know about mermaids? What do we think about mermaids? Are they sirens who lure people to their death? Are they frightening looking? Are they seductive looking? And why are these monsters these ways? And why do they change over time and fit a particular culture, a particular society at a particular time? But they can change from time to time, also from culture to culture. What about zombies? Lots of zombie stuff out right now, right? Lots of dystopian perspective, lots of end of the world, and along with that comes zombies in all sorts of shapes and sizes with all sorts of characteristics. What about Frankenstein? When I say Frankenstein, this one's sort of tricky, isn't it? If we're familiar with Mary Shelley's novel titled Frankenstein, we know that the main character is one of the main characters is Dr. Frankenstein. And then there's a creature that he creates, and I like to use the word creature, but how many of us use the word monster to refer to the creature? But how interesting that many of us call that creature or monster, depending upon our perspective, Frankenstein, when actually the character Dr. Frankenstein created the creature. So who is really the monster? And I think Mary Shelley's asking that question throughout that novel. We'll have a chance to explore that a little bit as we continue to do our reading. So in addition to envisioning each creature, monster, and what that may look like to you personally, how did it make you feel when you envisioned each monster? And why do you think that's what you envisioned and that's how you felt? And that leads me to my next question. Where do we find monsters? Where did you discover, where did you come up with the image that you saw and the feelings that you felt about those monsters? And I want us to think about how monsters are native to fiction, right? That's where they sort of start in literature, in folklore, in mythology, uh, but also in different cultures. Here's another arachnid, right? I have another spider for you, but it's not a natural spider. It's not a spider you'd find in nature. Yet, is it now created to be a monster? But notice it's created, right? Uh, but our monsters begin in fiction, yes? And so with fiction and culture, let's go with fiction right now. You'll find monsters in all sorts of media and in all sorts of genres, right? They've had a continuous presence in history, in the history of modern popular culture, certainly. And you can see some of those pictures to the side. We've got from 1818, I mentioned Shelley's Frankenstein. We have Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1897. Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897. And so you can see some of these fictional, and I'm talking more about Western civilization, but there are other monsters from other cultures that could be going even farther back than that. Where monsters really begin to take off even more, they capture people's imagination in literature, but it's the cinema that really garners more popularity for our monsters, right? And film really serves to popularize monster stories. Think about, I've listed a few monster film names and that have been adapted, but even think about how many different vampire films there are. How many have you seen? And how about the many modern vampire television shows? We've even moved beyond the Vampire Diaries and the Twilight and that's a film, that's a TV show, and then the True Blood, and now we've got Legacy, a branch off, right? But also King Kong. King Kong continues to uh, pique people's interest and appeal to something in their fears because we just had a King Kong and Godzilla movie recently, right? There are so many different monsters and so many different monster movies. So now, why are monster stories popular? I want you to ponder this for yourself. I want you to think about if you like to see monster stories or horror films that have monsters in them. Why are you compelled to watch them? Why are you compelled to see them? And Stephen King talks about this a little bit in his piece, as do some of the authors that you are reading this week. And so you want to keep that in mind too, if you agree or disagree with some of what they're saying. But to put it simply, on the simplistic perspective and the very sort of obvious perspective is, first and foremost, monsters provide us a form of escapism, right? It's a place for us to be entertained, and dumb or simple or easy entertainment, right? Uh, but I want us to consider, from what are people escaping? I get the entertainment, but what is it that we're escaping that we would want to enter into this space with these monsters and be thrilled or horrified by them? Uh, Okay, so I continue to have a little bit of technical difficulties, so we may have a few pauses here and there, but let's go ahead and see if we can get back to our discussion, and please be patient. I'm trying to be patient. It can be really frustrating to have technical difficulties, but we will make it through. Give me 1 second. Okay. All right, so we've already started to look at the simple answer. Uh, and is this the only function of monsters? Or is there a more complex answer? We want to think about the concept of why are monsters constructed? What purpose do they serve? What do they help us to work through as human beings, no matter what culture we're in? And so, first and foremost, I want you to think about all the different monsters that you're familiar with, that you've heard of, that you've explored, or that you like, or that you're very frightened of. And I want you to think about how they are established uh, through ideas about otherness. The monster often represents the other, and there's usually a majority of folks who determine what is acceptable and what is included in a society, and they also then determine what is other, and that other can deal with race, culture, politics, social implications, socioeconomic standing, classism. It can deal with abled and disabled folks. It can deal with sexuality, gender, all sorts of things can be a part of what some deem to be the other. And how do monsters then become representatives of that other? And then I want you to think about also the ways in which monsters can be imbued with political purpose in terms of being a representation of something of national import. And so something that the whole country should be afraid of, or the whole country should guard against. So it can be almost propaganda-like. The monster can be used as a sort of propaganda, can it not? And so now let's bring it to more right here today with us in our English 101, 101H class. Why study monsters? Why should anyone study monsters, right? Well, let's think about it. We have monsters are a part of an integral part of human history, right? And then they also help to reveal pertinent examples of the human experience. Ultimately, monsters help us to uncover and reveal and identify and sort of name our human fears, our human preoccupations, our the social issues that we are coping with. It shows us, monsters can show us how a culture defines normality. What is normal? What is abnormal? We can see that by looking at a monster. And this is really interesting. If we wanted to do a historical overview, we can see how at a given time the monster changes and what's considered normal or abnormal, what's considered acceptable or other, and how that morphs throughout time within a given culture is pretty fascinating. I've already mentioned this, but monsters help to explain why society creates the other. What about cultural enrichment? Particularly if we look at monsters from different cultural lenses, or if we look at monsters that originate in different cultures and why they originate in those cultures, doesn't it help us to understand other cultures and be exposed to being more knowledgeable about other cultures as well as our own? Another reason that we might want to study monsters is to contribute, to explore and contribute to scholarly thought. We can add to the pool of scholarly thought. And then more specifically for our purposes here with this class, it allows us to delve deeply into a single theme. We can see how this theme and our focus on monsters and types of monsters and how monsters work, we will look at it from so many different facets and so many different angles that it's going to help us become mini monster experts in this concept of monster theory. It's actually a true discipline. Monster theory is a discipline. It's an academic school of thought. And so there's some weightiness to it. Uh, we'll talk about that. UCI has a whole discipline and classes geared toward it. So many of us love our monsters. How many of these? Some of us love to hate our monsters. Some of us just straight up love our monsters. I'm a baby Groot girl, but Groot's an adult too. How many of us do we like the Hulk? What about these more benign monsters like Shrek, and challenging whether or not Shrek and Fiona are even monsters? How about the Munsters? Lord of the Rings, if you're interested in Gollum, is there more to him than just being a monster? So there's lots of things that we love to explore and look at. And so let's ponder might be the benefits of from studying monsters. What can monsters teach a member in a group? Well, first we want to think about the ways in which the monsters perform supernatural or mythical functions, right? So they serve as portents or warnings. Often our monsters can warn us that if we don't change our behavior, something can go incredibly awry. They can provide object lessons. Monsters can be used as a way to be didactic, to teach us a moral or a lesson, or help us with our ethical, moral behaviors, right? Monsters can be also central figures in the construction of the heroines and the heroes. The monster becomes the antithesis of what a hero or heroine looks like, right? They can also perform sociological functions in that monsters can embody a society's deepest fears, their social preoccupations, their social anxieties. What is a society anxious about? What is a society fearful of? So not only does it deal with individuals, but it can deal with a collective. The monsters also signify differences and help us to define the other. And there's something interesting that happens when we define the other and determine whether we fit in what is considered acceptable or if we are part of the other. And I want us to think about socially what happens when a majority determines that some within their society are not a part of the majority or not a part of the group, and they other those people. What can that do to society? What does that do to members within the society? What monsters can also reinforce cultural boundaries. What are the boundaries in our society? What are behaviors and actions that we should not engage in? And do our monsters engage in those crossing of those boundaries, pushing of those boundaries? And do we see what the fallout is if a monster pushes those boundaries and the ramifications of that? And does that then serve as a warning, like I said earlier, but does it also help to reinforce what a culture's boundaries are? Again, what happens if we don't all agree with what those cultural boundaries are? What if the monster is representing an other that is just a marginalized or oppressed group within a given society? Then what are we to do with that? So notice monsters can really do more than just scare us, right? Monsters can also teach people useful knowledge. They inspire wonder and demand analysis. Over 65,000 people, this was a statistic from last year or 2 years ago, over 65,000 people take a UCI class on zombies each year. Or have taken it. That lets us know that there is something to it, right? To it, and I mean to the studies of monsters. So that we can be on the same page, it's often important to, particularly if we're writing an essay, to define our terms. Not every single term needs to be defined, but if there's a core term that's at the core of whatever it is we're discussing or we're arguing, it might be beneficial for us as an author to define our terms so that our audience is viewing the term in the same way and there's no confusion. And so I want to highlight a few things. There's something about abnormal form or structure, mythical, deviating from normal or acceptable behavior, even immoral, threatening force, animal of strange or terrifying shape, something monstrous, a person of unnatural or extreme. And this is important, ugliness. That's so fascinating to me. Who determines what is ugly, what is not ugly? And what is ugly to some can be beautiful to others, right? And so deformity, what's deformity? What does that look like? Wickedness or cruelty. So now we're getting to characteristics. So we're getting to physical characteristics, we're getting to personality characteristics. So this is a really fascinating definition for us to look at. Here's the term monstrous, and notice you'll see some of the same ideas being put forward, carrying over from monster. But again, we've got this deviating from the natural form or character, abnormal. Again, who defines what's normal and what's abnormal? So this is really, really interesting. Strange, unnatural, gigantic. So if these are the definitions that we're looking at, what happens when these terms are applied to human beings? When we call a human being a monster? And when might we do that? And so as we go through this semester, we will move from using fictional examples to looking at human beings and determining whether or not we agree that human beings can be monsters or at the very least behave monstrously. Here's a monstrosity. And so again, malformation. This is really interesting to me. This focus on a formation, right? An abnormality, a deformity. Again, how are we defining those terms as a society? Who gets to determine what is abnormal, deformed, or malformed? And then again, we have this frightening size, force, or complexity. That's an interesting idea. Something complex makes it a monstrosity. And then excessively bad or shocking example. Because the term normal was used so much in these different definitions, I thought it was really important for us to look at it here. And we're going to spend some time over the course of the semester defining for ourselves and determining and discussing and debating what we think about this word, this term, this concept, normal and normality. And this is interesting, the occurring naturally. That's something I think is important for us to consider and keep in mind as we discuss things. And then finally, normative. I think this is important because if we as a society determine and define for ourselves what we think is normal and what we think is then abnormal, what we think is natural or unnatural, then that means that we will base standards of behavior. We'll create and determine norms, norms for how we behave, norms and standards for expectations for how we treat one another, the boundaries of our society, so on and so forth. I think it's interesting too, conforming to or based on norms, normative behaviors, prescribing norms. What happens when a society says that this is the norm that we should all have, but there are others in the society who that's not normal for them? Are they automatically thought of as abnormal? Then are they automatically thought of as the other? And then are they automatically treated as if they are monstrous or a monster? So I want you to keep all of this in mind as we move through the class. I've got this question for you, and I'm going to ask you to respond to this in another online. So please come back to this and revisit it. And then you've also got this idea as well. So I look forward to seeing more of what you have to say about these couple of slides in the upcoming discussion board. So, what do you imagine some of the possible effects of marveling at monsters might be? Here's a couple of things that I hope is going to be true for us, and some other ideas that we can continue to ponder over the rest of the semester. But how do cultures set standards of beliefs about love, beauty, sexuality, success, justice, good and evil, social conflicts, fears, and tension between race and gender? So consider how do monsters help develop important messages that we internalize and later act on for better or for worse? So if we identify with a monster, might we then internalize that loathing, that fear, that hatred that others have for the monster and think of ourselves as someone who is deformed, unnatural, abnormal, and instilling of fear? Do monsters become a way for us to define what's normal and natural and to create others who align with the unnatural? Do our monsters help make it easier for some in society to marginalize or be prejudiced against others in society? If we more clearly understand the role of monsters in our society, might we make more conscious decisions about whether or not we want to conform to normality, or even if normality, the normal, is preferred or acceptable? By looking at our monsters and who they represent and who's treated as an other or a monster within our society, does it help us to, as a culture, as a group, determine whether or not our definition of normality is incorrect or faulty or not is too narrow? And then finally, when considering monsters, might we move to a place of wondering at and a celebration of difference? Rather than being afraid of, horrified by, might there be a way for us to see the beauty in and or celebrate the difference between people? So lots of different things for us to ponder. Please do come back to these questions. I'll also bring them up throughout some of our future discussions. And then finally, I wish you go forth and marvel at the monsters in your culture. So I hope you enjoyed that little discussion, and I hope that you continue to ponder, and I look forward to hearing from you soon. Take care.